Well, hello, everyone. It is good to see you. This is Joyce Davis. I am the president and CEO of the World Affairs Council of Harrisburg, and this is the beginning of our webinar series, Great Decisions. Tonight's topic is going to be, and the video that we will see is going to be about climate migration. And I have invited Donald Brown, who is an internationally acclaimed expert in climate change, to join us, but he's had a little bit of technical difficulty, and I'm going to allow him to talk now. I see he's joined us as a general public participant rather than via the speaker's link. But Don, are you able to hear us?
Okay, can you hear me now?
I can hear you very well. I just wish you were on camera and join us via the speaker's link. If you can sign off at some point and sign back on with the speaker's link that was sent, you will be on camera and we will be able to do that. So I would hope you do that right now. I'm going to set up so that our audience here, our participants, can see the video. And maybe if you sign off, sign back on that speaker's link that I sent. It's different from the general membership, the general participants. And that way you'll be on camera as well. If not, sign back on here and at least you'll be able to hear and speak.
Okay. Joyce, I see several emails you sent me and none of them is designated speaker's link, but.
Well, if you look at the ones I've just sent, just recently, that I sent to you from Zoom, from the Zoom thing, it probably wasn't from Joyce, but from Zoom, click on one of those links and it will get you in. All right. But right now, let's at least, if you can't get back in that way, it's fine. We'll just do it this way and you can at least talk and share your thoughts. But right now, my screen, and then we can watch the video. All right.
Okay.
All right. So let me get settled here and get the video started.
That doesn't seem like it either.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for joining us for this 8th and final topic in the Great Decisions Masterclass. Today, our attention turns to climate migration. As we look at the global system, there are several regions of the world that we consider to be pressure points for the migration of people for a variety of reasons. In our hemisphere, people traditionally move to the north into the United States and Canada, from Africa and the Middle East especially into Western Europe, and those people in Southeast Asia who feel the need to move oftentimes go to Australia or New Zealand. The response of Western nations to migration has varied along this spectrum from soft line, represented by a desire to accept all migrants, to a more hard line position where migrants in general are rejected. Neither of these extremes is tenable. We cannot simply allow migrants to enter our country unfettered. At the same time, the humanitarian impulse and the needs of our country long term tell us that at least some migrants must be accepted. What we're left with is the very difficult policy process of managing the flow of humans as they cross international boundaries. Managing migration happens in stages. If people from country A are moving to country B, there are 3 basic places where flows of migrants can be managed. The first is in the sending state itself. If the situation there is dire, a lack of economic opportunity, a brutally repressive regime, or general insecurity, investments can be made in country A to lighten or alleviate the number of people who might decide to leave. The next opportunity to manage migration is on their way to their desired country. We can have people move to third parties, providing countries with support necessary so that they may house on a permanent or temporary basis those who have decided to leave country A. And finally, we can focus on policies here at home. Once a migrant reaches our borders, how do we treat them, handle, and process them? On what basis do we accept them and on what bases do we reject them from entry into the country? Migration falls into broad categories, voluntary and involuntary. Someone who leaves their country voluntarily is probably doing so to find a better job, to join family members abroad, and to enjoy the freedoms allowed in that targeted country. Involuntary migrants are looking for any job because there is not one back home, and they're oftentimes bringing their family with them, flying to safety, as opposed to the devastating situation in their country of origin. Oftentimes they're escaping danger. The challenge of climate migration is that it crosses this broad boundary. Both voluntary and involuntary migrants are oftentimes leaving home because of climate change in their country of origin. Let's look at ways to differentiate migrants. As you see here, there are a number of people seeking safe refuge or better opportunity abroad. We could apply one standard. What is in our best interest? Of these migrants, which have the job skills, the language skills, or any other determination that we apply that makes it in our interest to accept them. In so doing, we identify a subset of the larger migrant pool to allow into the country. On the other hand, we could ask what is best for the migrants themselves. What do they need to find safety and security? And in so doing, we identify a different subset of the migrant population. It may be that some migrants, two in this example, qualify both for what is best for us and is best for them. So where do we draw the lines? Do we allow this group into the United States? Do we focus instead on that group? Or do we limit ourselves only to those migrants who need to enter the U.S. and reflect our best policy priorities? What is politically possible is an intervening variable, because politics is deeply divided over how to handle migration policy. About a decade ago, the so-called Gang of Eight, these are senators from both the Republican and the Democrat Party that formed a small coalition to develop a policy on migration they believed was acceptable by both political parties. In 2023, the Gang of Eight is dead. There is no middle ground. You either accept migrants or take up a position of rejecting them all. It was Ronald Reagan in the 1980s who said, "I believe in the idea of amnesty for those who have put down roots and lived here, even though some time back they may have entered the country illegally." That was a soft line approach to migration that enjoyed bipartisan support in the U.S. Congress, even though it opened up the floodgates for migration moving forward. While it was billed as a policy of one-time application, amnesty sent the signal to people far and wide that if they arrive in the U.S., even illegally, put down roots and stay out of trouble, they will be awarded a green card and a path to U.S. citizenship. When NAFTA was signed in 1994, merging the economies of the United States, Mexico, and Canada, there was broad bipartisan agreement on migration. Both Democrats and Republicans agreed at the same level as to whether migration strengthened the country. The divide between the two political parties began around 2006 and has broadened dramatically since. NAFTA, a driver in this debate, largely resulted in a wedge between the political parties to the extent that America in 2016 was ready for a populist candidate who promoted building a wall to keep out Mexican migration. When we ask people today what really matters to them heading into the next election, climate change and migration, today's topics, rank 4th and 5th respectively. It is only when we combine them into climate migration that they climb the ladder to the point of being equal to the global pandemic. Today, there are three main considerations before we think about U.S. foreign policy. We'll look at and define climate migration, consider the cause and effect of migration, and then finally consider climate change itself. Climate migration happens when natural disasters cause people to leave their homes. 21.5 million people each year migrate because of natural disasters. The vast majority of them are internally displaced, meaning they leave their homes and villages, but they stay in country. The experts estimate that by mid-century, because of global warming, sea level rise, drought, and forest fires, all driven by changes in the climate, that number will climb to some 140 to 1 billion people worldwide, and they will be international refugees, crossing boundaries, entering Europe, Australia, and the United States principally. Climate migration happens in two stages. First of all, people move from their farms, from rural areas, because there's no longer the feasibility of growing food due to climate change. They move into population centers, where they become impacted and feel the need to move abroad. They do that in the second stage of climate migration movement. A dilemma is then faced in the new host country. Do we accept these migrants? Do we send them back across the border? Do we try to fix the situation back home so that they can return to the country of origin? As we look at our area of the world, the southern United States and Mexico, it's pretty clear that levels of extreme or exceptional drought are happening on an annual basis. This drives Mexican farmers to the cities and on to the United States. Worldwide, the projections for the decade of the 2030s are rather dire. Drought is anticipated in much of the areas of Asia, Africa, Latin America that have been driving migration for the past generation. If we look to the law for a solution, we find a gaping hole. Migrants of opportunity are largely covered by domestic laws. Unless someone is forced from their home out of a well-founded fear of persecution, domestic law allows us to reject them. If they are seeking refuge and are asylum seekers, there are international laws that exist that condition our domestic response to refugees in asylum categories. In between the two, we find climate migrants. They are not covered by international or domestic law very effectively. We do have an interesting case study considered a landmark decision back in 2020, when a man from Kiribati, a sovereign nation in the Pacific, made his way to New Zealand, forced from his land because of climate change. His asylum request was denied by New Zealand. A United Nations Human Rights Court, however, ruled in his favor, making him the first climate refugee in modern world history. Let's now look at cause and effect. Codifying rules to deal with climate migrants is incredibly difficult, because when we see people in a country of origin decide to leave for some reason, our decision on whether to accept or reject them is determined by the reason for their departure. If it was war and violence, they may be asylum seekers. If it's for economic opportunity, those asylum laws don't apply. And for sheer poverty, we're more than likely to say they're not genuine asylum seekers. The problem is that climate migrants are driven out of their country because of poverty, the loss of jobs, and oftentimes climate change leads to war and violence at home. It makes it very difficult to differentiate those who are seeking safety from persecution from those who are simply looking for a better place to live. The United Nations High Commission for Refugees has 90% of refugees under its mandate as being from countries on the front line of climate emergency. This sounds like the overwhelming majority of refugees are indeed climate migrants. That, however, is not the case. It's a misleading statistic, because if we look at all of the global undocumented migrants, those under the mandate of the UN High Commission is a very small percentage. Only about 10% of all global migrants are covered by the UNHCR agenda and mandate. Climate change, of course, is a focus of this lecture and this foreign policy great decision. What is certain about climate change is that it's happening. People can debate the causes of climate change, but there's no doubt that the air and the water are getting warmer. The implications of this climate change are borderline overwhelming. The solutions to solving it are complex and multifaceted, requiring cooperation among many nation states. And within those nations, there's a great political divide over what to do about the changing climate. There are three key actors in the United States in dealing with climate change-related issues: the scientists who present their data, the elected officials who must make the laws, and the general public who must support those elected officials. Back in 1987, there was a consensus in the public, among the scientists and elected officials, that chlorofluorocarbons were eating a hole in the ozone, protecting the Earth. As a result, the Montreal Protocol was reached, the United States was a full-fledged supporter, and the ozone was protected moving forward. We simply changed the way that we cooled air for air conditioning purposes, and we banned aerosol sprays. That sort of widespread agreement is essential for successfully addressing climate change challenges. Confronting climate change. Many argue for more actions, while others argue for less action. The problem with the public in the United States is that we are equally divided between and across this spectrum of action. Climate change itself is changing. 40 years ago, we talked about global warming. That language turned to climate change, which is much more digestible for the American public, because oftentimes climate change involves a cooling of the weather, as opposed to simply warming. Climate change is now giving way to what we call extreme weather, something that everyone can see happening around them and that both political parties can rally around to confront. The costs of extreme weather are growing exponentially. Between 2000 and 2021, on average, we spent about $32 billion per year in addressing extreme weather disasters. In 2002 alone, that toll reached $65 billion, doubling the annual average, and that is before we add to it the catastrophic cost of one Hurricane Ian, which struck the southwest area of Florida. That nearly doubled the extreme weather cost in 2022. Only a few weeks ago here in Florida, a minimum level 1 Hurricane Nicole hit the southeastern portion of the country, adding another $500 million in expenses. Environmentalists argue that not only is less action not desirable, but that more action isn't enough. We need to take massive action to address the climate change crisis that the world currently confronts. We saw this graph in the very first lecture on energy geopolitics, where the amount of money the United States would need to spend moving forward is more than triple our traditional spending levels in addressing climate change and hitting our 2030 goal. This is highly problematic financially, even more so when we consider that as we invest increasingly in solar, wind, and water sources of energy, this is a highly inflationary force that raises the cost of investment. We now turn our attention to foreign policy options in addressing climate migration. Not that long ago, our focus was on a slowly changing climate. Now we realize the changes have accumulated to the point that we have to reverse climate change. International accords have addressed this issue in places like Paris, Kyoto, and Rio. But increasingly, it appears that we're headed for a hot planet no matter what we do, that we're going to have to respond to a world where certain portions are simply no longer livable and where agriculture is increasingly limited in where it can be grown. The American intelligence community and the Pentagon have reached this point of discussion. Recently, the Pentagon has concluded that climate change poses a risk to our national security. The military has been dragged into the political fray, as governors from Texas and Florida bus migrants in their states to Washington, D.C., the Pentagon has been asked for assistance in helping with that transport and later guarding those migrants upon arrival. The U.S. intelligence community issued its first national intelligence estimate on climate change, focusing on cross-border geopolitical flashpoints. What it is stating is that climate change is causing conflict abroad that is forcing people to cross international boundaries. Our ability as a nation to formulate policy to address climate migration requires agreement across many boundaries, political and international. We need a domestic policy that addresses climate migrants, coordinate that policy with other nations. We cannot look at migration in a vacuum. It originates across international boundaries. Those migrants flow into the United States. For this, we need long-term bipartisan political consensus that's based upon a broad level of U.S. public support and buy-in. When we don't have political bipartisan consensus, which we clearly don't, that undermines any broad base of American support for the policies that are necessary. Bipartisan agreement is necessary. Partisan divide represents a significant obstacle to successful policy formation. We have options at our disposal. We can focus on our own border. We can attempt to divert migrants before they reach the United States, or we can aid those countries, places like Honduras, Guatemala, Mexico, and Venezuela, that are primary sources of migration in our hemisphere, where people are seeking refuge in the United States. I'd like to thank you all for joining us for this 8-lecture master class in U.S. foreign policy. We encourage you to stay engaged and make great decisions.
Well, there you have it. That was the overview of our topic, climate migration. And some of you may have been thrown off hearing migration first, but that's the basis. People are moving, and they are moving basically because of climate change and of what we're seeing, the violent weather that as is the result. We haven't been able to get Don Brown to sign in on the camera, but he is here, and he is able. Don, you have been able to follow the video, and are you prepared to be able to talk to us?
Okay. Can you hear me, Joyce?
Yes, we can hear you. I can hear you very
Okay.
well. I want to make sure you're here, but before you talk, let me at least let them know who you are. Again, we're very sorry he's not able to join us on camera, but it's his mind and his ideas that are most important. But Donald Brown is a scholar in residence for sustainability, ethics, and law at Weidner University Commonwealth Law School. He teaches international environmental law, human rights, and climate change law. In November 2019, Don Brown was awarded by UNESCO in Paris the Avicenna Award for Excellence in Ethics and Science for his work on climate change ethics. That is the thing. That is the wonderful thing that Don brings to the table. It's not just science, but it's morality and ethics. And that's kind of what we're dealing with today when we talk about people being forced to move. The award that he received also came with it $50,000 cash prize. You're rich now, Don, and an invitation to discuss the need to get traction for ethics in solution to global threats. Don has an extensive background. He lectures throughout the world. During the Clinton administration, he was program manager for UN organization at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency's Office of International Environmental Activities. And he had a major position in representing the U.S. in negotiating the UN climate change biodiversity and other sustainability issues. So that's a little bit about Don Brown. But Don, let you talk now. If I could find a picture of you, I will try to put that up. But at least tell us what your initial thoughts are on migration and climate change.
Well, thank you, Joyce. What you're doing is so important for the world, and people don't understand. Right. So,
Don, I'm afraid, are you speaking into the microphone?
okay.
There you go. I hear you.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes, I do.
Yes.
That's good.
Okay. I will just go over the highlights of this incredibly important problem for the world. In 1997, the Clinton administration sent me to the Army War College, who was talking about national security threats from climate change. And they predicted, for instance, that if there was a drought in Syria, it would create millions of refugees, and it happened. Okay, now why the Army War College is interested in this is the Army War College explains in detail that this will create security threats. It will create war. Okay, that's why they're interested in it. They also talked about several other parts of the world in 1997. Okay, can you hear me, Joyce?
We can hear you. Keep going. Keep going.
Okay. They also talked about 3 countries in Latin America, Honduras, Guatemala, that would create security threats from refugees created by climate change. Why I gotten this recently, that we have all this political discussion about the refugees on the southern border, but not a word about the climate change connection. So I've been talking to my friends, why aren't you talking about the climate change connection? And they said, well, we can't tell how many of the refugees on the southern border are created by climate and how many are created by social disruption. So we're working again with people from the Army War College. They've given me a number of how many refugees on the southern border have been impacted by climate change. And the number they came up with is 1 million refugees. Climate change may not have been the original source for people fleeing, but it has intensified the problem. Again, why aren't we talking about this? I also, in 1997, most people still don't know that climate change, everyone agrees it's human caused. In 1997, I was asked by the Clinton administration to manage a negotiation at the UN, getting every country, to try to get every country in the world to agree that climate change was human caused. Most people don't know. I'm still blown away by how many people I run into that don't know that there is now an agreement that it's human caused. Why this is so important is because to get done what needs to be done, which is to go to zero carbon, the world drastically needs countries to set a zero carbon goal. The United States is actually in the last couple of years have gone up rather than down. And the US has been stymied at every step by legislators. There's 165 federal legislators that are climate deniers. So one of the things that the fossil fuel industry has done is get people elected who are climate deniers, and they're still there. So I will be working with attorneys general. I think there's 20 cities that have sued the fossil fuel industry for its atrocious disinformation campaign, and they're suing the fossil fuel industry. But that's not enough. We got to get legislators to know it's not okay to not support going to zero carbon. And when I went to the United Nations, asked me why some rules that everyone agreed would govern their submission on climate change, why they didn't get traction. And then get traction because the legislators, the vast majority of them, 160 federal legislators, according to the Center for American Progress, are still climate deniers. People in America don't know that in 1997, in a negotiation I actually managed, the OPEC countries all agreed it was human caused. The IPCC said it was human caused, but people do not know that. And Exxon is, as recently as a few months ago, we're still not willing to say that it was human caused. They're now out misdirecting people, saying that they're going to try to support some climate solutions, but we desperately need to get everyone to understand, and particularly the legislators, that we have to go to zero carbon. The next COP in United Arab Emirates, everyone realizes there is a historical emergency to get everyone to go to zero carbon. Yet we have these migrants on the Texas border, and the press isn't linking it to climate change. I've come up with figures. I'm about to publish it based upon recommendation of the Army War College. Again, this is the Army War College talking about the emergency, not the Sierra Club. Okay, they're worried because of the fact that they believe, and they explain in detail, it will create hostility and risk the United States. In fact, they say the countries that were always anti the United States will be more hostile when they find out that they don't have any water and the United States is responsible for it. Now, here's one other thing, and I will end there. I really hope we get the word out on this. One of the reasons why people don't understand why many things about climate change is because it's really different than air pollution problems. Greenhouse gases go up in the atmosphere. Some of them are removed in a couple hundred years, but a lot of them remain for thousands of years. So the temperature is being controlled by the atmospheric concentrations of greenhouse gases, which is at an all-time high. But we've been talking narrowly about the 1.5 and 2 degrees centigrade Paris Agreement warming limit goals, which is misleading. I just finished a book with identifying 40 ethical issues that need to be understood when a nation develops its response to climate change. And the experts got it all wrong because they didn't understand. It's not like air pollution. It doesn't go away. It stays up there. What this means is that the greenhouse gases that we have set up 50 years ago are part of the problem. So it would take me some time to explain this, but it's really important to get the average citizen to understand how it's dramatically different than other air pollution problems. So
Well,
the
Don,
reason for the
I think
importance of
you've made a
understanding.
very strong. Yeah.
Okay.
I was going to say you've made a very strong case. I mean, here that this is human made and that it's urgent. It's past urgent from what you've said, and you've been saying that now for several years. But I guess one of the questions that is out there, and even one that I see Russell has asked, is that given the elected officials in the US can't agree on the cause of climate change, you still have so many climate deniers. Is there any hope that have we made any progress in at least chipping away at climate denial? And I'll open this up also to our participants, because I'd love to hear what they have to say. If you'd like to share your thoughts, even in a comment by typing it in, or let me know and I'll unmute you. I'd love to hear if you think what you think, if we've made any progress on people understanding climate change. But Don, what do you think? Any more understanding?
There is widespread understanding about the harm that Exxon did in the denial movement, but they don't understand the practical significance of all of that for policy. By the way, the Frontline series on the power of big oil is amazingly good at explaining the mischief that the fossil fuel industry did. So I don't expect, by the way, anyone that doesn't know this to agree with me because I said it. I speak to people that I know are hostile all around the world, and what I'm trying to do is engage people in serious dialogue. I can tell you, I sat and had responsibility for the negotiation in 1997 at the UN to get every country in the world, including the Saudis, that it was human charged, and they all agreed. The evidence of human causation, people don't know that because we're doing a bad job of explaining the evidence of human causation. There's fingerprints and attribution studies. And so the press is doing a really bad job of explaining why everyone agrees with this. In the meantime, the evil of what the fossil fuel companies have done is worked. So I reported back to UNESCO, the reason why we haven't gotten traction is because people don't understand two things: why climate change is different, and also why every country in the world and every scientific institution, including the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and 17 academies of sciences, have all agreed that it is human caused. I don't expect anyone to listen to that, to believe it because I said it, but I can tell you that every country in the world, every academy of science, but yet the fossil fuel industry is still sending out people who don't peer review their material and claim that it's not human caused.
Right, it's natural.
One of the
But
reasons why we
open it to
have
some of our participants here to get some questions from them. I see people, if you do have a question, you can send me a chat or raise your, or just let me know in some way through the chat, and I will unmute you and you can ask your question, or you can type your question into the chat if you'd like to do that. One of the issues that questions here that comes with the briefing book says, as you read and as you watch the video, many individuals are forced to relocate, we see, from climate change, and often they can't afford to do that. So what is the responsibility of the United States? What role should our government play in assisting domestic climate refugees, people in this country who have to move from place to place, right? Because that's happening here as well. What role should the U.S. government play in assisting international people as well? You want to take that, and then I'd love to hear what some of our participants say. If they let me know, I'll unmute them.
Let me just tell you one thing. One thing has just happened, which is positive. The United States agreed that countries like the United States are responsible for losses and damages. They haven't agreed on the amount, but at the last COP, the developed countries and the United States, much to my surprise, agreed that if we cause loss and damages, we have to help fund solutions to it. Now, there's already a fund for adaptation, but what is new is losses and damages. But the amount of money we're talking about is astronomical, and so it has to be negotiated. So there is some money that will be available, which the Art of War College said the United States should do something like that, because if we don't, it will intensify the national security anger. I could, I work at the UN and I talk to UN officials. They used to think that the United States was the leader on global governance, but they don't anymore. There are 12 international treaties. We haven't ratified 10 of them. Okay, we're really an outlier, and very few people in the United States know that, because you keep hearing claims that we are the indispensable party. There's a book written, that's no longer the case. People go to the European Union, not to Washington. So that's another part of it. Why I'm doing this is to encourage further, deeper reflection on this. And the press is doing a terrible job, I think. I'm very friendly with leading reporters, and I keep asking, why aren't you talking about this? And the answer they gave me about the southern borders, they didn't know how many on the border were from climate change or other social strife. And I now have a figure that I'm going to publish on my website, which is 1 million of the refugees on the southern border have been impacted by climate change. Climate change may not have been the reason why they became refugees, but it's been made worse. They call it a threat multiplier. Now, what's good about that, the press can't duck the connection to climate change anymore.
Well, let me, so are we any closer, do you think, to having an actual policy on, first of all, on international migration, immigration based on climate change, but also just internally, when people are forced because of flooding or whatever, when they're forced to move, is there any policy, is there any tax incentive, something is what's happening to help people?
No, and the former speaker identified the international legal issue that is at stake. Climate refugees are not refugees under international law. The refugees get rights to enter countries, so the law has to be changed to make climate refugees to get the benefit of international law on refugees. And that's starting to be discussed seriously.
So
unfortunately, we're really running out of time. The tipping points are starting to tip, and that's such an interesting issue that hasn't been discussed. We agreed to something called the precautionary principle in the climate treaty, which means uncertainty is not an excuse, but yet no one ever talked about it. Never, ever, no one ever, I've been in the middle of this at the national level. I've never heard anyone say that scientific uncertainty is not a valid excuse for fulfilling your obligations under the climate treaty. Michael Mann did not know that if you can't use normal rules to develop causation, that the precautionary principle also requires you to do what's called precautionary science. And the failure to talk about that is a failure of the United States. The European Union has adopted it across the board. So there are principles that we agreed to that most people don't know about, nor understand why they're so important.
So some progress sounds like is being made, at least in the policy level. But let me ask you this. A question is here concerning just how dire things is and if we continue to say how dire they are, does that just numb people? So Russell is also asking, if a zero carbon goal were achieved today, what difference would it make to the damaged environments that are causing climate immigration or climate migration? And the other thing that's here is that they're saying this is the form of messaging where even I hear you saying it may be too late, it may be too late. Is that really hurting? Because people think, well, what's the point?
Well, I understand why you asked the question. It's a reasonable one to ask, but the world has to go to zero carbon or we're really screwed. Okay, life on Earth, there's been, the 1.5, 2.0 warming limit goals were based upon an assumption of when the tipping points would start to tip. There were 6 major tipping points, and the other bad news is they're all starting to tip. So it's worse than the models predicted. The models did not include, when I heard this, I could not believe it. the models used by IPCC did not have the methane permafrost in the models, one of the tipping points. And the reason why they weren't in the models is because the scientists didn't know how to apply the precautionary principle or whether they could. I think for the sake of this was the Army War College's sense, to prevent military threats, the United States needs to correct what it has done wrong. A lot of
But
people have told.
that would only make us more terrified, right? I mean, if they correct it, how much worse is it?
Well,
I mean, I know it'll be the
I
truth.
happen to know, I've traveled around the world, and they say if the United States, the one good thing about the United States is it could correct injustices. Okay, it was celebrated for that. But actually, something called the Powell memo, misinformation we haven't been correcting the injustices of environmental problems.
Right.
So
let me ask Jackie to come in. She has a question right along those lines. Jackie, do you want to ask your question? I've unmuted you. I guess she doesn't want to ask it, so I'll ask it for her. She says, do you know if there are any plans to help the country of Bangladesh with their flooding going forward?
Bangladesh, the minimum sea level rise, according to NOAA, is 2 feet. We're probably going to have much more than that. At 2 feet of sea level rise, I think it creates 1 million refugees just in Bangladesh. Okay. So I think the Army War College was right. If we don't start acting responsibly, it will create military stress. But I have reason to believe, that when I've showed up in I've taught in countries and they said, the reason why we like you are acting like Americans used to act to correct injustice. So I think the hope is in taking seriously the funding for adaptation and for problems like mitigation. And I was really surprised. Biden agreed to it.
So there is some hope. Rachel, I unmuted you. Do you want to ask your question? She may not speaker either. So I'll tell you what her question is. There is a huge difference in degrees, but 1.5. Every fraction of a degree matters. She says, no matter how bad it is, we should keep it from getting worse. I guess but I guess the question that so many people have who aren't as expert as you, and I want to get this through to them. Whatever we do, will it make a difference? Will it help? Or
of course it will. Yes, it will. And I think the time of focus will be if the US goes into the next COP agreeing to zero carbon. And by the way, there are, I think, 30 countries that now have net zero carbon as their goal. And some of them have not only the goal, but made it legally enforceable. So there is movement at the global scale to go to zero carbon. And I think there's 8 or 9 countries that not only have a zero carbon goal, but they made it legally enforceable. So I think if we start doing things like that, we will help people, but we'll also reduce the anger at the United States. Again, I tell people, don't believe this because I said it. I'm trying to get you to think about this. And just a couple of years ago, people wouldn't talk about going to zero carbon. And even, so we have to, uh, the test will be whether the next COP in United Arab Emirates, we will walk in there with a zero carbon goal. That's priority number one, I think. And I think now that we know that Exxon was misleading people,
Mm.
the challenge is to get the politicians to support the zero carbon goal. And I don't think that's impossible. But
You
that
don't think
should,
that's impossible, even with the most right-wing Republicans? You don't think that's impossible? And there are a
well,
lot of them.
yeah, well, yeah, I didn't say it wasn't an enormous challenge, but now that we know that Exxon lied,
Mhm.
there is one really good politician, his name is Senator Whitehouse, who's trying to get Americans to know how much they have schemed against the American interest. And by the way, the other thing that happens all the time, if you even talk about this, they call you a communist or socialist. And what I've discovered is that Adam Smith obviously believed in markets, but he believed that corporations would scheme against the public interest. And so I think we now have a way of talking about this, which also will be a defense against a claim that we're socialists and we don't believe in markets. So there are a lot of
What one of the questions that's actually here is that businesses often have to change their practices, and in some cases have to relocate because of climate change. So, and it says innovations by the private sector often have a positive impact on the fight against the climate crisis. So how can world leadership encourage market-driven innovations related to climate change?
It's a good question. A lot of people are thinking about that and recommending market-driven responses. I do think the conversation will change about all this pretty soon. The question, will it be soon enough? And unfortunately, I think there's 163 federal legislators that are still climate deniers. And oh my God, there were so many in the state legislature, it was just outrageous. So the hope is that the sociologists always said is to get the people to understand what's really going on. And it's a democracy problem. By the way, one person who has been an incredible inspiration to me among many is a woman by the name of Hannah Arendt, who explained that whenever anyone's power is threatened, they will lie. So lying's always a problem in democracies. When peoples whose interests are threatened will lie, and they will pass it on without knowing whether the lie is true or not. So my thought is we have to expose, it's already exposed, the frontline program on the power of big oil is just absolutely amazing. Okay, I would highly recommend it. It's well done, it's thoughtful, it's credible. And so the hope is in helping people understand the lies that Exxon was doing. Hannah Arendt also said that if people tell the truth, we should forgive them. She was a proponent of the Truth and Reconciliation movement, okay, in Africa, which was so beautiful. I'm actually going to recommend that if the fossil fuel people admit that they were wrong and pay some damages, that we would do what the Africans did in South Africa, which, so Hannah Arendt is a very, very smart, thoughtful person about all of this, and how to deal with lies.
Let me throw another topic out here for you to chew on, and that is you clearly have made a name for yourself around the globe because you've said this is a moral issue.
Yeah.
an ethical issue.
Right.
So do you believe that the faith community, nationally as well as internationally, is doing anything to help push the truth, so to speak, and to help lobby legislators?
Yeah. Well, there have been some religious leaders. I mean, amazingly, the Dalai Lama and the Pope spoke passionately about the moral dimensions of this. Unfortunately, Americans don't know what that means for policy. Okay, so we have to help the Americans see the policy implications of climate change policy. I just finished a book on applied climate ethics where we identified 40 moral issues that climate change raises. Americans don't talk about it that way, but why it's so important is the practical significance of identifying. And by the way, the chapters were written by 14 people from 9 different countries. So I think you, Joyce, really understand the importance of talking to people in foreign places, but there's some wonderful, thoughtful people around the world that are working on this. And
well, let me say this. I do believe, and I know you have great hope in our young people.
yes,
But I do believe as next generation comes forward, because I talk to them all the time,
Right.
the high schoolers and the college, they are absolutely convinced that drastic action needs to be taken. They're not
Right.
climate deniers by any
No.
stretch. So is that where your hope really, and do we have time for them to become adults and voters?
Well, when they gave me my award in Paris, they brought 10 Greta Thunberg kind of people to the meeting who had already changed their policy in their countries. They not only spoke like Greta Thunberg, they got policy differences. So, yeah, I think there's, I really believe that the Greta Thunbergs, the young people, what you get with them is they're not afraid to say bullshit. Okay, and I have learned a lot from Greta Thunberg. I've learned I didn't realize the theory of rhetoric has a theory about how you convince people about injustice, and she does it. She does all the things marvelously. So I've learned. I have a friend who I work with who's got a PhD in rhetoric in Germany. And he said he's learned from Greta Thunberg how you do it. Okay, it would take me some time to explain that. But
that
number
is
one,
the hope. Do you think
that's the hope.
time?
The young people are the hope. Of course, it's not surprising that anyone that makes traction, the right will try to demonize them. And they've been trying to demonize Greta Thunberg too. But so the hope, the UN sees hope in the young people on this issue. And they brought to the UN 12 young people about Greta Thunberg who not only talk like Greta, they got their governments to change the law. So sometimes people call me a Don Quixote, but Don Quixote gets back on his horse when he sees these 12 young people in Paris.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much, Don. This is, as we can see, this is an urgent matter. And it's one that, I mean, we just hope that our lawmakers are able to see what's happening very clearly in front of your eyes with the extreme weather. And that extreme weather is only going to get more extreme from what the scientists are telling us, correct?
Yeah, it's going to, And Senator Whitehouse is marvelously doing what he's doing. He's trying to explain people how this happened. And sociologists said, don't just talk about the solutions, explain to people how it happened, because this is a problem for democracy. And if people understand who caused the suffering, they'll come out and vote. Okay, so it's a democracy problem. And sociologists who I trust said, help people understand how this happened. We've just seen an amazing example of this. Women are coming out to vote because they're angry that their right to make decisions about abortion. So I think the sociologists are right. Just don't talk about the policy, but help people understand the causes of their misery.
Well,
Because you
that's the
want to
thing.
activate.
Yeah, that's what's so
Because
sad, that it's going to be a lot of human suffering that could be avoided if we could
yes,
all come together and do
yes,
the right thing.
yeah,
Let me
it's
just, Roxana has a question. She says, why do we want to use windmills to produce power instead of water turbines, as Japan and other countries do to produce energy? She says, keep in mind that windmills utilize a lot of fossil fuels to build them and make up the
yeah.
components of a windmill. Do you want to comment on that at all, Donald?
What I want to comment on is within the environmental community, there are believers in different technologies who have different reasons. And what I've learned, amazing what the fossil fuel industry was, they paid some of the environmental groups to not adopt windmills. Okay. And so many of the technologies have problems, but policy, we should get enforceable goals to go zero and not have to decide the technology that works before getting the political commitment to go to zero, I think. And so it's an important issue, but it's way low in the priority of issues that the public has to understand.
Well, Don, as we close, as we draw to a close, what is it that you would like our participants, the people who've joined us, and also the ones on Facebook to know? If you could tell them 3 things they need to do right now that would help this, what would those 3 things be?
Number one is to get the politicians to support a zero carbon commitment for both at the state level. The state has finally adopted a policy, but I don't think it's enforceable yet. But number one is to go to the next COP, getting all the countries to agree to zero carbon emissions goal. And I do think that's possible because I think there's something like 40 countries that have now zero carbon commitments, and some of them have made it legally enforceable. So so there's where the hope is, and that's what myself and my friends think our priority should be, is to help people demand as a democracy project going to zero carbon. Now, of
So
course, if
that's
you
number
do,
1. There are 2 or number 3 that things that they could do, maybe help educate their neighbors on that.
yeah, there's so much that people don't know about this, that greenhouse gases hurt everybody because they all go up in the atmosphere and mix. Okay, so every ton of greenhouse gases, it's not like air pollution where you have an event and it hurts people near it. You really have to go to zero because it's hurting everybody. And the failure, and the academics make this mistake all the time. Actually, I'm going to say something very controversial. The university, do you know that the fossil fuel industry has been trying to shut down liberal arts programs? This is so, I don't accept this because I said it, but the people in the Powell memo recommended that universities shut down liberal arts programs and only put their money in science and technology studies. And when I heard they were doing this, I was just, now they obviously, there was a movement called neoliberalism. Do you know about that, Joyce?
Go ahead, explain it to us, please.
Okay, this is such an important historical turn, but very few people understood it. I didn't understood it. Um, Clinton actually believed in it. You don't have to regulate anything. You let the market solve everything. Okay, and it really took over. It took over in the United States. When I go to the United States was implementing this globally through the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, and they were conditioning loans that other countries had a reason to believe would be available if they privatized everything. And when my wife was with me, and the leaders were really angry at the United States for doing this, and I understand why. But there was a movement that started in the 1970s where government would stop using government to solve people's problems, that they would use market alone. And this is a big historical development. Most Americans don't know about it. Most Americans don't even know that it happened, but it did happen. And so, by the time Ronald Reagan was president, they had successfully using public, very sophisticated propaganda, get people to believe that the government isn't the solution for anything, it is the problem. And
Yes, well,
okay,
that's the problem. Yeah, because
okay,
we need
but
to operate on this.
there are ways. I am creating something called, I'm working with other people, how to respond to false, intimidating, manipulative smears that you will get, that you're a socialist, for instance. Okay. So there's a whole bunch of things that people that are interested in the government doing, you know that it will happen to you, and we have to help people respond to that. For instance,
well, the truth is, some of us who have lived overseas and are aware of different forms of living, that's not necessarily a bad word. I'm not saying it, I'm promoting it in socialism. It's not necessarily a bad word to people who've lived in the world.
Let me, you're absolutely right. People think Denmark is a socialist country, and the president of Denmark says, we're not a socialist country. We believe we have to attract the capital. There's place for the market. But we also think that the citizens, if they want to pay for better healthcare, they should do it. So there are ways of dealing with these obvious things you're going to be hit with that are really quite compelling, but people don't know how to do it. So I'm working with people to help people respond to the socialist call. None of the progressives in Europe believe the government should run the economy. None of them do. Okay. Right. But Americans think that's what socialism is. Okay. And
well, I'm afraid we're out of time. As we can see, there's a lot to discuss when you talk about climate change in general, but when you talk about people migrating, people over international borders as well as nationally, people having to leave their homes, lives uprooted because we've not done what we could to prevent this kind of suffering. It's time that we really treated this, as Don Brown has, as a moral issue.
Well, yeah, it's surprising, when Americans used to think that the reason why you protect the environment because you have duty to protect people from suffering, but we don't. We talk about it in cost-benefit analysis. Everything has been the moral issue. I had a $30,000 grant to test students in science and technology if they could pick out the moral issue in a claim. Every claim about the common good already has a moral conclusion. There are facts and moral conclusions, and the students couldn't pick it out, but they could with a little bit of training. So that's another, the fact that we're producing people that can't distinguish a factual claim from a moral claim was predicted, by the way, but the fact that it's happening.
I hear what you're saying, but we're also covering here amongst the press parents who are not wanting their children to be trained in any way in character development.
Yep.
That's a bad point. Now they have good
Right.
character. So
Right.
with that, I'm going to have to thank you, Don, for being
Okay.
a part.
Well, thank
And-
I know you understand the importance of this, so I'm delighted to work with you. And I know
Well,
you
you're
understand.
truly one of the great people with a legacy of good and a historic legacy that's with us. You saw and you understood this issue long before most Americans even could, so for that we are grateful, but there's still a lot of work to be done, and we're glad we doing it.
Whatever we can jointly do to get the word out about this, I would like to work on. The press is not engaged.
Right. Well, I'm working with 2 reporters right now who are working to around the country to kind of make it a people story. Here's what climate change is doing to people, and that I think might help us open some minds and also open some hearts. So with that, I want to thank the participants who came. As you see, we could go on and talk to Don Brown, who has a wealth of knowledge on this all night. But Don, thank you again. And sorry we couldn't get the tech worked out, but what we got from you was very well worth it. So thank you.
Thank you. Okay.
All right. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.